30 minutes. That was all it took 3 weeks ago in Toronto for a Wednesday night session at a WTA 1000 event to become completely sold out after organizers made one very specific scheduling decision. Wimbledon and the US Open were among the biggest major events in the sport, and yet this particular night created a situation tournament officials were not expecting. They moved a 21-year-old player from a smaller court into the main stadium. She was not the number 1 seed. She was not coming in as the defending champion. She was Alex Eala. And now, as the Cincinnati Open moves into its first week of main draw action on August 15th, the exact same pattern that surprised Toronto's ticketing department is reportedly starting to appear again in Ohio. Filipino tennis fan accounts have been circulating claims this week that resale prices for sessions involving Eala have risen dramatically during the middle of the week, something that has reportedly caught parts of the tour off guard only days before a second-round meeting with Elena Gabriela Ruse. Whether every individual price figure being shared online is accurate is still unclear, and some of those viral claims are still being checked. But the larger mechanism behind them is much harder to ignore. Something is changing in the way WTA 1000 tournaments decide which players deserve the biggest courts. To understand what is happening in Cincinnati, you first have to understand what Eala brings with her when she arrives. She enters the Lindner Family Tennis Center as the number 17 seed, ranked world number 20 in the latest WTA rankings, and carrying a 7-1 record on North American hard courts this summer. Less than 2 weeks ago in Washington, she became the first Filipino player in history to win a WTA Tour singles title. Now she enters a draw that could potentially put Amanda Anisimova in front of her in the third round, Linda Noskova in the fourth, and possibly Jessica Pegula again in the quarterfinals. That is the setup, and that is what fans are buying tickets to see. But there is something tournament officials rarely explain publicly. When a WTA 1000 event creates its daily schedule, court assignments are not based only on which players are technically the biggest names. Behind the scenes, there's a much quieter discussion involving 3 separate groups: the tournament director, the head of ticketing, and the broadcast partners. Court seating tells organizers who appears important on paper. Ticketing data reveals who fans are actually willing to pay to watch. Broadcast numbers indicate which players are capable of attracting viewers in specific markets. When all 3 signals point in the same direction, the decision becomes easy and the player gets center court. But when those signals disagree, someone behind the scenes has to decide which number matters most. For much of the season, Eala's basic seating profile suggested that she belonged on outer courts. Her ticketing numbers were telling tournament officials something very different. That difference is where this entire story begins. Cincinnati is not necessarily the first tournament to encounter this problem. It is now the 3rd consecutive event where Eala's growing popularity has forced organizers to react differently. In Washington, tournament chairman Mark Ine personally greeted Filipino supporters during finals week and thanked them for continuing to show up throughout the tournament. In Toronto, tournament director Carl Hale went even further. After the Wednesday night session sold out, Hale told reporters at a sellout that early in the tournament was, in his words, something really unheard of. That quote was published by The Athletic on August 7th. It was not simply promotional language. It was a tournament director publicly acknowledging that Eala's presence had disrupted a ticketing pattern he had been operating within for years. Now Cincinnati is dealing with a similar question, but there is one major difference. Cincinnati does not have Toronto's enormous Filipino population nearby to explain the demand. Estimates put the Filipino population in the Cincinnati metropolitan area at roughly 1,000 to 2,000 people, nowhere near the size of Toronto's community. So if the demand being reported in Ohio is genuinely rising in the same way social media posts are suggesting, it is not simply coming from local residents. It would mean fans are traveling, driving, flying in from other states, and competing for resale tickets. And if that pattern continues, it changes the financial calculation for WTA tournaments going forward. Start with the most important number, the one that is actually documented. Toronto's Wednesday night session sold out in approximately 30 minutes. That was not a marketing slogan. It came directly from Carl Hale describing what happened inside his own ticketing system after Eala's match was transferred from the roughly 2,800-seat grandstand to the main stadium. Volunteers who had already received Wednesday night tickets were reportedly asked to exchange them for future sessions because demand had changed so quickly. Think about what that means. A WTA 1000 tournament was effectively rearranging part of its own volunteer ticket allocation in the middle of the event because one player's court assignment had created a surge in demand. That is the scale of the phenomenon being discussed. Now add the second piece of evidence. Just 2 days before Toronto, Eala had won the DC Open final against Jessica Pegula by a score of 4-6, 6-4, 6-0, becoming the first Filipino WTA Tour singles champion in history. Immediately afterward, tournament chairman Mark Ein did something that you do not often see from tournament executives. He personally went toward the Filipino fans in the stands and thanked them for supporting the event throughout the week. That moment matters because Ein is not simply a fan representative. He is a businessman running a major sporting event. Tournament owners and chairmen generally do not personally seek out one specific fan community unless the commercial impact of that community has become significant enough to notice. In the language that tournaments actually understand, the message was straightforward. This player is moving tickets, and organizers need to pay attention. That brings us to Cincinnati and the actual structure of the draw. As the number 17 seed, Eala received a first-round bye. Her opening match is scheduled for August 15th against Romanian player Elena Gabriel-Ruz, who advanced after defeating Magda Linette 6-3. 6-3. If Eala gets through that match, she could face Amanda Anisimova, currently ranked world number 10, in the third round. It would be their first meeting on tour. If Eala then survives Anisimova, Linda Noskova could be waiting in a potential fourth-round matchup. Noskova has already defeated Eala twice this season, winning 6-2, 6-0 at Indian Wells, and then 6-2, 6-4 in the Berlin semifinals. Every one of those players has the ability to attract attention on her own. But when all of those names are positioned inside one section of the draw, with Eala sitting at the top of it, the combined effect can produce exactly the kind of demand signal that tournament ticketing directors describe as unusual. And this is where it's important to slow down, because the story can easily get lost in the argument over individual resale prices. The viral posts circulating online are focused on whether a certain dollar amount appeared on a particular resale website at a particular time. That is one part of the discussion, but it is not the biggest story. The larger development is that the WTA's business system appears to be adjusting in real time to a player whose commercial pull may now be greater than what her ranking alone would suggest. That is unusual. It is also why this moment deserves a closer look. The third layer of evidence comes directly from the tournament environment, and sometimes that is the most revealing evidence of all. In Toronto, one food vendor reportedly changed a menu item during the tournament, replacing chicken teriyaki with Filipino chicken adobo rice bowl in Eala's honor. That was not something necessarily planned months ahead as part of a marketing campaign. It was a reaction to what the vendor was seeing around the venue. The number of Filipino flags, shirts, and supporters in the concourse had become impossible to miss. Fans arrived wearing custom shirts carrying messages such as Rise, Believe, Inspire, signs in Tagalog, including messages translating roughly to I love you, appear around the courtside barriers. When Eala walked toward the microphone for her post-match interview in front of approximately 10,000 people, she asked the crowd for louder support in Tagalog before switching back to English. She then thanked the crowd, pointing out the large number of Filipinos and the many flags around the stadium. Those comments were reported by The Athletic on August 7th. A tournament cannot simply manufacture that kind of reaction. A player has to build it one crowd at a time. Eventually, however, the crowd becomes large enough that the tournament itself begins adapting around it. And that is exactly what appears to be happening now. Another important signal came from Coco Gauff during the Canadian Open. Speaking about Eala, Gauff described her rise as something that was great for the sport and for players, emphasizing the importance of one athlete being able to connect a sport with a nation that previously had little representation at this level. Venus Williams, who partnered with Eala in doubles at Bad Homburg and again in Toronto, went even further by describing her as a world star. Jessica Pegula, speaking after the DC final, called Eala an amazing player and added that she was not fun to play against. These comments matter because they are coming from people inside the same professional environment. They are not distant observers. These are the players who notice changes in the locker room first because they are directly competing against someone whose profile is rising rapidly. Still, perhaps the clearest voice in the entire story is Carl Hale, because he was a tournament director who actually experienced the ticketing decision in Toronto. His comment about the Wednesday night sellout being unheard was not simply a prepared promotional line. It was a working tournament professional describing, with some surprise, a number that had broken his own expectations. Behind that decision was another important figure, Jason Milani, who serves as head of ticketing for Tennis Canada. Milani, who is Filipino, was reportedly the person who first alerted Hale that demand from the Filipino diaspora was building around Eala's matches. He had been hearing from members of the Toronto Filipino community for weeks. When the original court assignment placed Eala on the smaller grandstand, that internal ticketing information helped trigger the move to the main stadium. That is the mechanism people rarely see. This does not normally happen through a giant public announcement. It happens through a conversation between the tournament director and the ticketing department, while the latest demand numbers are sitting in front of them. One side looks at the schedule, the other looks at the sales data, and suddenly a player who was originally assigned to a smaller court gets moved to the biggest stadium available. Cincinnati is now having its own version of that conversation this week.